different types of studies in cross-cultural research. There are many different types of studies out there that look at cultural differences and cultural similarities. A few of them may include studies such as cross-cultural validation studies, Indigenous cultural studies, and cross-cultural comparison studies. These three make up many of the studies that are conducted in cultural research, but not all. So today, we'll just be highlighting these three. Starting off, what is a cross-cultural validation study? This is one that students confuse a lot, so pay attention. This cross-cultural validation study is one where you examine a scale, a test, or a measure to see if it is valid in another culture. The idea here is to establish equivalency. Establish that whatever you're using to test happiness, depression, anxiety, and stress is an equally valid measure in all the cultures that you plan to use it in. There are many studies out there that start with, this is a scale for social support that has been used in these cultures, and our current study plans to demonstrate the validity of this scale in Portugal, or in Germany, or just in another culture that hasn't been looked at yet. So a cross-cultural validation study is one that takes a measure or some kind of survey instrument you're using and seeing if there is an ability for you to use it in another culture. To see if when you use it in another culture, whether it'll mean the same thing, get you at the same concepts. Another type of cross-cultural study are Indigenous cultural studies. Now, this term is slightly problematic, mainly because it conceptualizes a kind of hierarchical relationship where these types of studies are conducted on indigenous cultures. And this is seen as more civilized cultures coming in to study a lower or less civilized culture. There is some connotation of that with indigenous cultural studies. So, as a term, it has some issues. In general, it refers to rich, complex descriptions of theoretical models within a single culture. You can think of this as an ethnographic study, right? It's a deep dive into a singular culture, not comparing it to any other culture, but looking at that culture, observing it, talking to people in it, and trying to understand how that culture looks like, and writing up a paper describing it, describing that culture's values and how it is looked at and understood by the people living in that culture. You might conduct an indigenous cultural study by going to a Packers game and looking at Packer culture, right? You might be someone who's interested in studying that cultural context, and rather than comparing it to other football fan groups, sports fan groups, you are just looking at Packer culture. You might go to a Packers game. You might talk to Packers fans. And you might write up your experiences after observing the game and talking to people who are part of it. You can, and the intention of this is that you compare your deep dive to other deep dives within other cultures. So you do, or you can use the insights generated through an indigenous cultural study to compare the results across cultures. The difference is the study itself does not start with you comparing two different cultures on a single variable. That, my friend, is a cross-cultural comparison study. This study, or this type of study, is one of the most common types of cross-cultural studies. When you think of cross-cultural research, the study that comes to your mind is probably going to be a cross-cultural comparisons. Basically, this is a study where you're taking two or more cultures, gathering participants from those cultures with the purpose of comparing them on some sort of variable. some sort of psychological thought process or behavior, that you're comparing how parenting works in two different cultures, that you're comparing levels of life satisfaction in two different cultures, but that you start with an idea of what you want to compare, and then you compare it in different groups. That is a cross-cultural comparison study. So in this study, the results are compared within the sample, that the participants you gather from different cultural contexts will be compared against each other on how they raise their children, on the types of food that they eat, or how they exercise or maintain healthy behaviors. Thinking about these three different types of cross-cultural research, what kind of study do you think the Rice hypothesis was?